Hi, welcome to my presentation titled Understanding Factors Critical for Long-Term Desistance in Male Drug Abusers. My name is Fann. I'm Assistant Director and a Psychologist at the Correctional Research Branch at Singapore Prison Service. This is the scope of my presentation today. I will briefly cover the background and impetus for this study, what was the research methodology, a few of the top-line findings from this study, as well as some recommendations following the study. So briefly, the background to this study is that in prison, we actually conducted a research study to understand factors related to relapse, shorter-term desistance, and longer-term desistance. So the research question was, why did participants relapse or desist from drugs in the long term? And long term was being defined as a minimum of 5 years. And the reason why 5 years was chosen is because there are some evidence in the literature suggesting that a minimal period of 5 years suggests a stable abstinence, as participants will be less likely to relapse to drugs after a period of 5 years. For today's presentation, we'll be focusing on one main question, which is what are the differences between desisters who desisted between 2 to 5 years after release and desisters who desisted for 5 years and more. This is the research methodology. We had a total of 92 participants in which we categorized them into three different groups. The first group is the group that we termed the fast relapse, or FR for short. So they are the participants who relapsed within a year of their release. There were about 37 of them, and we recruited them while they were during their period of time with us in prison. The second group of participants are what we termed as the slow relapse, or SR. So they are the participants who relapsed within 2 to 5 years after their release. And there were about 25 of them. And they were also recruited during their time with us in prison. The last group of participants are what we call the drug desisters, or D in short. They are those who have desisted for 5 years or more, and there were about 30 of them who were recruited from halfway houses during their time in the community. We conducted semi-structured interviews with all 92 participants, and we did the thematic analysis with inductive coding method used. So these are some of the top-line findings that we have. The top-line finding number one is that desisters have stronger sense of agency that sustain their motivation to change. So we saw that for the relapses and the desisters, both groups actually started with a strong motivation and desire to change. However, the differences were that one, for the relapses, which means those who relapse within 2 to 5 years after release, they presented with a lack of agency as they viewed that they had no choice over their eventual relapse outcome. They also lacked perseverance to persist in their journey of change and to resist temptations along the way. However, for the desisters, they continued to surround themselves with pro-social others and role models who helped to sustain their motivation to change over time, especially when they start to meet with more and more temptations or barriers along the way. And what happened was that over time, as they had more and more successes in resisting temptations or overcoming their difficulties, eventually they had a shift in the narrative and the identity. And that gave them a sense of purpose and direction and further enhanced their sense of self-efficacy and agency. So there is like a cumulative effect that we observe. I've selected two quotes, one from a desister and one from a relapsee, to highlight this difference. So for the desister, he said, you have to make the effort to be real, to go away from your old lifestyle, and to make effort to rebuild your life. You need to show people that you have made the change. So there is a lot of a sense of agency here about having control over his life and his actions. On the flip side, for the relapsee, this relapsee shared with us that when he met temptations, he felt like ultimately it's your choice. Who will win? The fight is in your head. How to control? You don't have the power to control your mind. So he felt that he didn't have the ability and the agency to do anything about it when he was faced with drug temptations. The second top-line findings that we had was that the desisters actually reported greater amounts of social capital. So both groups, relapsees and desisters, they reported drug temptations from antisocial peers along their journey of change. So both groups had difficulties with temptations. But the difference is that for the relapsees, they reported that they actually had lack of support from the people around them and their family. And the people who remained in their social circle eventually were the ones who provided them with both access and information to and about drugs. And what this means is that they faced increasing temptations along the way. They also had more and more difficulties in reintegrating back into society, such as making pro-social and positive changes over time, as well as difficulty in resisting repeated drug temptations because the people around them most of the time were either talking to them about drugs or asking them if they want drugs. On the other side, we see that for the desisters, even though they reported drug temptations as well, what they did was that they were able to persistently avoid these antisocial peers. And how they did so was they actually deleted those peers' contacts, or if they see them, they actually try to cut the conversations short and to walk away from these peers as soon as they can. And over time, there were less and less of these antisocial peers in their social circle, and this actually meant that they had a reduced access and information to drugs. But for desisters, it doesn't stop there. Not only did they remove these antisocial peers, they were able to replace them with pro-social family and peer groups that they met from different places, such as the halfway house staff and volunteers, or people from the religious and volunteering groups that they were from. So you can see this sister said, when I start having new friends, for example, people in church, I can go and openly speak up. I don't have to bottle up a lot of things. I purposely go and ensure that I find someone that I can talk to when I have problems. So for this particular sister, he had more and more people in his social circle who were pro-social and were able to provide him with the kind of support that he needed. In contrast, this relapsee shared that he only had his wife, but his relationship with his wife wasn't a very good one because she was not very supportive. She was very suspicious of his behaviors and did not really believe him when he said that he wasn't on drugs. And it got to a point whereby he said, if you keep saying have, then okay, lor, I touch and let you see, lor. So in a way, he kind of gave up on trying to prove himself. The third top line finding was that desisters made positive lifestyle changes. So for both the relapsees and desisters, they actually came from halfway houses, and they reported that the structured environment in the halfway house was a good training ground for them to focus on their rehabilitation and to prepare themselves for reintegration. However, the difference is that for relapsees, after their time in the halfway house, when they were out in the community, they actually reverted back to their unhelpful behaviors, such as going to parties or drinking, or repeatedly found themselves being bored, unemployed, or had dissatisfying employment. And when they continued doing these things, having these unhelpful behaviors, they were actually continuing to put themselves in high risk situations, which resulted in their eventual relapse. For example, some of them, when they drink or when they smoke, they actually found that they had some lapses in their judgment that resulted in them relapsing back to drugs. On the flip side, for the desisters, what they did after their time in the halfway house was that they replaced their past unhelpful behaviors with purposeful and pro-social activities, such as occupying their time with volunteering work or attending religious services and groups. And they continued to be watchful of their triggers and high-risk situations. So this sister talked about how he was doing part-time studies in a Bible college. On top of that, he was a full-time youth pastor in church. Outside of work, he would spend most of his time with his family members, with his kids, his wife, or he will go and engage in his hobbies such as cycling. So he was doing a lot of positive things that helped him to build a new lifestyle. And along the way, it helped him to meet a lot of people, whereby he was able to share his story and gain support. So these lifestyle changes actually also help to build the kind of social capital that I talked about in my second top line finding. In contrast, for the relapsee, this particular participant, he reported that after a while, he felt bored because everything was the same. He go back from halfway house, means he go back to work, and after the work ends, he go home and there's nothing to do at home. So there was that boredom there that eventually led him to relapse. The fourth top line finding was that desisters practice more adaptive coping strategies. So both relapsees and desisters faced numerous life problems in their journey of change and reintegration. So both groups had issues. However, the difference is that for the relapsees, when they met difficulties, they actually engaged in maladaptive coping strategies such as substituting their urges for drugs with alcohol and cigarettes, which actually made them more susceptible to relapsing back to drugs while under the influence. They also relapse back to drugs as a way to enhance or to numb the low moods, the negative emotions, or to seek a temporary escape from the loneliness or from the boredom, and to find comfort from the lack of support that they have from the people around them. In contrast, for the desisters, when they faced life problems, what they did was that they learned multiple adaptive ways of coping rather than avoiding all the time. And they were able to tap on the social capital that they had built up earlier. They also tapped on what they learned from their time in prison when they underwent interventions, as well as intervention programs at halfway houses. And they applied what they learned from these programs in their lives to deal with the problems that they faced. And this prevented them from relapsing back to maladaptive coping strategies such as alcohol or cigarettes or eventually drugs. For this desister, he said that he was able to find himself in an environment which was very supportive, where people supported him, helped him to learn certain values that he did not have before, and helped him to understand and accept the disappointment that he has caused, but importantly, to move on and to see that his life has a bigger purpose. On the flip side, for the relapsee that we interviewed, one of them said that, they felt lonely. And when they feel lonely, what he did was he actually thought back about the past and how when he was on drugs, his only friend or his best friend was drugs. And now that he was outside and he felt lonely again, the first thought that he had was his drug use again. The last top line finding is that desisters have positive shift in their attitudes. So both the relapsees and the desisters group, they actually underwent counseling or the interventions that I talked about earlier, either at a halfway house or during their time in prison. And both groups found these activities to be beneficial and motivating for them. However, after the release, for the relapsees, they either ignored or didn't consider the consequences of their actions, or they actually engaged in certain forms of justification, such as telling themselves that they were able to escape being detected from that urine sample will not show the drugs that they had consumed, for example. They also reported attitudes such as thinking that drugs were not that harmful, and they also possess an absence of reflection, which made them unsure about the reason for their relapse during the time of the interviews. For the desisters, they actually internalized the consequences of relapsing. So not only were they cognizant of the consequences, they actually consciously internalized these and always remind themselves that if they were to relapse, it will impact not just themselves, but also their family and a new life that they have already built up. For the desisters, they also developed values such as being positive, remaining humble, and open-minded to learning and receiving feedback, and having the discipline to stay away from drugs. And all these were important to aid them in their reintegration, especially when they start to encounter challenges or difficulties along the way. For this desister, he said that he did not want to go back to prison anymore. He was aware that if he were to go back to prison, he will lose what he has right now, his family, his children, the house that he managed to buy, his new lifestyle, his new friends. And he was very happy and very contented with all these things that he had. But he would lose all of it if he were to go back to drugs. Whereas for the relapsee, he said that at a time when he felt those negative emotions, he didn't think about the consequences. And all he thought about was to get high. So in summary, there were 5 key differences between desisters and the relapsees, or rather those who relapse between 2 to 5 years after their release. And the difference is that for the desisters, they have a stronger sense of agency that sustain their motivation across time. They also have greater amounts of social capital for them to tap on to support them when they had difficulties. Over time, desisters managed to make positive lifestyle changes, and they also were able to develop and hone their adaptive coping strategies. And all this also help them to develop a positive shift in their attitudes. And here are some of the recommended strategies that arose from this study. One is that during the in-care phase, when we have the abusers with us, it is important for us to try to share Desistance findings with them to help them to create a sense of ownership and agency over their own journey of change. It is also important that continuous enhancements to rehabilitation programs are made as and when we have new insights and new findings from research studies such as this. It is also important that our programs and policies include processes that support the Desistance journey and takes into consideration the kind of challenges that a desister might face on his Desistance journey. It is also important that we upskill our staff to engage those who under their charge and to help them to optimize their Desistance outcome, because they are the main touch points with these abusers during their time with us. At the pre-release stage, before the abusers are released, it is important that there is a systematic referral made for abusers to aftercare services and to leverage community partners to enhance release preparation in areas of human and social capital. This is so that abusers, when they go out, they will be able to leverage on existing social bonds or create new social bonds, and also to expand family work to enhance their outcomes. As we see that family relationships is also a very important role. Lastly, in the aftercare phase, we hope that we will be able to influence community partners towards using common language and have a common mental framework for Desistance. We also hope to expand community corrections to increase opportunities for reintegration, and for aftercare work to focus on increasing agency for the desisters in the face of challenges across time, and to help them to shift their narrative identity and how they view themselves as time goes by. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your time.